Welcome to Amazon Legends, where we have real stories about making it big on Amazon. Our guests are CEOs of large companies and entrepreneurs who became power sellers, also providers specializing in helping sellers, aggregators that acquire sellers, and former Amazonians will give us an insight from behind the scenes. Here is your host, Nick Urison.
Welcome to another episode of Amazon Legends. And I am so lucky to have so many former Amazonians on this show because they are a breath of fresh air. They give you the real perspective. And today I have another former Amazonian, and he was also the ex-CTO of an FBA aggregator with over $100 million in revenues. So he understands scale. He understands all the moving parts. And today he is the CEO of Symphony, which is a SaaS platform that helps sellers optimize SKU margins when they are selling across multiple channels. And he's based in Seattle. And when he's not working, he likes hiking, camping, outdoors, and nobody will guess, 3D printing. So those are his interests. So with that, everybody, meet my guest, Elvis Dieguez. Welcome to the show, Elvis.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be on here. It's a pleasure talking to you again, Nick.
Oh, I love talking to, like I said, I love talking to smart people. It makes me happy. So it's you always learn something, and it's always dynamic. So what we're going to talk about and learn from you is something that large brands experience on day-to-day basis, and also the small brands or brands who are looking to grow. And let's face it, every brand starts with the intention to grow. Is something that they need to be aware of so that they can create their infrastructure to monitor. So this was the challenge that you have identified, and then you started building something around it. And you're going to share with us some of the intricate details of it. So what you tapped into is really a multidimensional challenge. It's not just one thing. So tell us what that challenge is.
Yeah, first of all, the key thing to remember is that big things start small, right? So even if you're a small company, as you grow, you're going to have to think about more sophisticated ways of running your business. And one of the things that my co-founder and I realized and thought about quite a bit is, as a brand grows larger and larger, the problems it has to deal with when you think about optimizing your profit margin down at the SKU level become more and more complex, because you have more levers, more dials that you have to churn. The interaction between those dials can be complicated. And you really have to think about how are you going to deal with that problem at scale. And typically when you think about it at scale, what you want to do is you want to have the right mechanisms, the right processes, and the right technology to be able to handle it. Because you're not going to be able to handle it through throwing more people at the problem or more time.
Yeah. Well, you just said something that completely resonates with me. Throwing more people at the problem, or even throwing more money at the problem, does not bring you the solution.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't, because if you think about it, the most valuable commodity that any brand has, that anyone has, is actually time, right? And so when you throw more people at a problem, what you're doing is you're putting in more time, right? You're putting the time that each person can spend on it. That's one solution to dealing with complexity. It's actually a valid solution in some cases, but the other solution is, there's only really two. There's throwing more people, or there's throwing technology or tools at the problem. And what the technology does is it actually reduces the level of effort. So instead of putting more time on it, you're reducing the amount of time it takes you to tackle the problem. And that's typically what you want to do more of as you grow as a brand. So in the beginning, you throw people, but as you grow as a brand, you want to start to think about how do you bring technology into it, and how do you start to really understand the complexity of all of the things that you can do as a brand. right? You have your pricing, you have your fulfillment strategy, you have your inventory strategy, you have your ad strategy. None of these actually operate in a vacuum. So what you have to think about is, how are they going to interact with each other? As you make a change to one of them, what impact does it have to another? That's the type of problem where throwing more people at it isn't necessarily going to help you. You really got to start thinking about, how do you get the right tools in place and the right technology and the right way of thinking about it to solve that.
Okay, great. So for our listeners, let me set up our conversation so they understand what we will be covering on this show, on this episode. So as you grow, first of all, you just heard from Elvis, putting people or just hire more people. That's not the solution unless you're doing a pick, pack, ship operation. Even then, you need technology. So we are going to learn about some key areas where you must employ technology, because it's the technology that will help you address the issue. The second thing is, what is the knowledge that you need in order to bring technology to scale your operation? And between the two, by knowing when and where to bring technology, and what kind of knowledge that you need to have in order to bring that in, then you will then have the knowledge, so to speak, the expertise to be able to scale your operation, grow your brand, and then make your millions. So, and the core subject here we will cover is measuring and monitoring and optimizing and maximizing ultimately your profit at SKU level when you are selling through multiple channels: Amazon, Shopify, Walmart, you name it. So with that, let's jump right in. So where do we start, Elvis?
You start with actually the data. So the biggest problem that brands have is not having access to the right data at the right time in order to be able to make decisions rapidly for how do you optimize your margin, right, down to the SKU level. And when you want to optimize your margin, you have to realize, like, there are a lot of variables that can impact that. So obviously your pricing is one of them, but it's not just your pricing. I think when you're a smaller brand, one of the things you worry a lot about is, how do you optimize your pricing to maximize margin? And that's important. As you grow, you have to continue to do that. But you also have to think about, how does changes to that variable, how does changes to your pricing impact your sales velocity, which then impacts the decisions you make around inventory and how you're going to fulfill those orders. You have to think about how advertising changes, especially if you're trying to optimize margin. One of the things you'll try to do is shape your demand so that you can go to one platform more or another platform, because it allows you to increase your profit margin. Being able to make all these types of decisions, the first thing you need to have is data. You have to have in place the right tools and the right technology to give you the data. And it can't be look at one data set, then look at another data set, then look at the third data set. You really have to have the ability to look at it at scale in a very integrated way. And so that's one of the things that, when my co-founder and I launched Symphony, was one of the first things that we got interested in tackling, is being able to give brands the ability to look at all of this data and the interplay between them.
Okay. And when you say data, give us specifically, what are you looking at?
So the first of all, I'd say 80% of the data you're going to look at comes from the e-commerce platforms themselves. So if you're on Amazon, if you're on Walmart, if you're on Shopify, you're going to want to look at the data they provide. So you're talking about orders, customers, the details of the products that you're selling. And you really want to be trying to understand advertising by the way that you're spending on these platforms. You really want to understand, how does your profit margin, again, down to the SKU level, how does that change as those things are changing, right? As your customer mix is changing, as seasonality is changing your demand, as you increase or decrease advertising spend on one channel or another. And you also want to think about how you can understand the interplay between the platforms. That's something that's really difficult to do. I think most brands want to be omni-channel. They want to be on multiple platforms, but because of the friction of doing it, they typically don't. And the very number one friction they run into is just being able to look at the data in a very comprehensive way. Typically, you end up with, you have your Amazon data, your Shopify data, your Walmart data, and now I got to make sense of this. That's a difficult problem, and that's one of the first problems we're tackling at Symphony.
Well, there is another challenge here, which is a challenge for every seller, is if you may have multiple channels to sell one SKU, but guess what? Your inventory needs to service all of them, right?
Yeah.
So how do you allocate the inventory without either overloading one channel or without leaving money on the table? That's another aspect of selling through multiple channels.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, that's what I meant about the complexity of optimizing for margin, because obviously if you have too much inventory on hand, right, then you're tying up cash non-productively. And if you have too little inventory, then you have stockouts, which can impact you more than just obviously the lost sale. Some of these e-commerce platforms like Amazon will penalize you, right, if you're out of stock too often. So that's the main reason that I said you have to have data and you have to have the technology and tools to be able to look at that across platforms so that you can really forecast, for example, how much inventory do you need to have on each platform, right? You need to understand how that demand will change over time. So you got to get into forecasting. And by the way, the reason this becomes really difficult for a brand is that the answer changes with time. It's not like you can do this calculation one time and say, okay, I know how much inventory I have to have. It changes depending on your pricing, because if you reduce your pricing, typically you increase your sales velocity. That's going to have an impact on your inventory decisions. If you increase your pricing, the reverse happens. Advertising can also have an impact on your sales velocity. It has an impact on how demand converts on one channel versus another. And so this is actually, the nerd in me, it's a multidimensional problem. And it's not one that you're going to solve by just throwing more people at it. On one hand, it's a math problem. You can actually calculate what is the optimal decisions to make in each of those areas to optimize your contribution margin. And on the other hand, you need to implement that optimization, right? So you got to set the dials in terms of how much inventory you have on each platform, what your advertising strategy is, what your pricing strategy is. And you can't really do this one by one. You want to really think about it as a holistic problem. You need to have both the ability to optimize, to understand what the right decision is, and the ability to implement it. So you have to have both.
Yeah. Multidimensional is exactly it. So there's so many things. So, I guess for our listeners, the biggest lesson right from this 10-minute conversation is do not go jumping into selling through multiple channels just to get the most revenue. Always go one step at a time. And I always tell people, start with Amazon because it has the largest market share. And then anything you do, every penny you spend, paid ads or otherwise, will give you access to the largest consumer base, or I should say the shopper base. And at the same time, it has one of the most comprehensive platforms to provide data. So, and the other thing is, by being the complex marketplace it is to operate as a seller, it will automatically start to discipline you as a seller to use technology and processes and other things. So before even you think about the second channel, get Amazon, get your infrastructure in place. And then once you start adding the next channel, then always what I'm hearing from you is look at the same data that you're looking at for your Amazon, look at it for each channel at the same time, real time. Is that the case?
Yeah, first of all, I'm an ex-Amazon guy, so I agree with you, right? You always, in my opinion, want to start an Amazon because it's the biggest marketplace and it has the most sophisticated tools. In fact, when Amit and I were at an aggregator, one of the things that we noticed with a lot of brands is they would try to expand onto another channel too quickly, too early. And so typically they would have invested some time and effort, but 2-3 years down the line, they were still 90 to 95% Amazon revenue. So they weren't getting a big return on their investment on another channel. That said, as you become a bigger and bigger brand, you do want to think about expanding because it gives you opportunities to further optimize your profit margin, again, down to the SKU level. And there's typically an order of operation that you want to do that as a brand. Again, as you grow, you want to start off on like an Amazon. And then when you expand, the first thing I would do is look at a direct to consumer DTC channel. So Shopify is like the best example. And then go down the line. Basically, I typically say go down the line based on market share, right? So in the US, after Amazon, the next biggest platform is Walmart. Again, excluding the DTC channel for a second. So you want to go in a very disciplined way. You don't want to be haphazard and just expand into another channel before you're ready. Once you're ready, you want to have a game plan. And typically that is you want to make sure you're going to have both the data and the processes and the tools. So you need all three to very effectively manage multiple platforms. And you want to start by doing that on Amazon first, to your point.
Yeah. So Elvis, I like to, I'm a big data guy and I love managing with numbers, or I should say managing through numbers. And I'd like things to be specific so that I can go start up doing something without really not knowing where do I start. So the data, obviously, we want to look at each channel, fine. We want to look at SKU level. So these are the pillars of what you are suggesting as how to manage. So look at data, look at it per channel, but across channels, and look at it real time, and look at it at SKU level. So these are the fundamentals.
Yes, and when you're looking at that data, you want to understand how changes in one part impact another part, because it's those impacts that will give you an opportunity to actually be able to optimize your margins at the SKU level.
So let's dissect the concept of data. What I'd like our listeners to be able to do is, oh, that's the data point I need to be tracking. So that's what I want to get to. So can you share with us some data points that they need to be tracking?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, again, the state of your business, of course. So as you get bigger and bigger, you want to track more sophisticated data points. But in the beginning, right, the biggest ones that I like to track is understanding how, for example, how changes in pricing impact your sales velocity, basically the elasticity of your product, because that's one of the first variables that you can manipulate in order to optimize your profit margin. You also want to understand who are your best customers and why they're buying product. What are they responding to in terms of your advertising strategy? So again, I try to look at the data and understand cause and effect. Okay, as I make this change to this parameter, pricing, for example, what's the impact? Now I make a change to advertising, what's the impact? And the reason you want to understand these cause and effect relationships is ultimately when you're trying to optimize your margin, what you're doing is you're setting those variables so that the impact is the largest margin you can get. And when you're a small brand, you can start practicing doing this on a single channel. So you can definitely do this within Amazon alone. As you grow and you get more sophisticated, and then you want to expand into other channels, and there are lots of reasons to expand to other channels. But once you get to that stage, now basically you do the same thing. You start to understand, hey, as I change pricing on Amazon, what impact does it have to my conversion rate on Shopify, on my DTC channel, or my conversion rate on Walmart? I can see how these setting the levers differently on Amazon versus, let's say, Shopify impacts conversion rates on each of those channels, how they interact with each other. That starts to give you an opportunity to decide how can you maximize your profit margin by setting those over time. Because, for example, during Q4, Amazon increases their fees, right? So you might start to think about, okay, do you want to somehow drive some of your demand onto another channel? If it makes sense, how do you do that? When you understand the cause and effect between the changes you're making and the outcome, then you're ready to start to make those type of decisions as a brand.
Okay.
And
cool.
again, you need the right tools, because you're not going to do this in spreadsheets, to be clear. That's usually the problem.
Oh, well, let me tell you this. Spreadsheets are fine, except that when you have two challenges, when you want to look at your performance data, they're not part of something Excel can or Google Sheets can handle. First and foremost, you have new data coming in every day. So you need to be updating the data that you're looking at. Number one. Number two, the more data coming in every day, that means more lines in Excel. The more, as the number of lines grow in Excel or Google Sheets, it's going to be a long time before you can even open that file, let alone do anything with it, right? So this is not an Excel, Google Sheets exercise. You definitely need professional help.
You do. I will share a little anecdote about Amazon. I think most people who've never worked at Amazon, they don't understand how it really functions. When you're in the beginning life cycle of a brand, right? Or even when you're more advanced, but you're trying something for the first time, I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with in the beginning trying it with Excel or Google spreadsheets. In fact, a lot of things at Amazon, and they're a $1 trillion plus company, actually start off in Excel. And I think when people join Amazon, they're constantly surprised about these scrappy solutions. But what you want to do as a brand is, as you start to understand what you're doing and what you want to do, that's when you want to bring in technology, to be clear. And that goes back to my earlier point that you don't want to do things too early for the sake of doing them. When my co-founder and I were at an aggregator, I saw this all the time. Like, do things for the sake of doing them, not really having a clear understanding of what you were going to get out of that effort. So you don't want to expand to new channels too quickly. You want to, first of all, understand how they work. You don't want to just throw people at a problem. You want to understand what are you trying to solve. And just like that, you don't want to just throw technology at a problem. You do need technology, but you really need to have a clear understanding of what outcome you're trying to drive.
Yeah. Well, you know what you just described to me is you have to do a proof of concept using Excel, Google Sheets, or anything else to see what it is that you're doing with the data, and then what you are able to do with it as an outcome. Figure that out before you bring more technology to it, right?
Yeah, so I think about it. You want to bring in the technology when you're ready to scale. That to me is always the key decision point. If you're still trying to figure out, like, what am I trying to accomplish here? Throwing technology into the mix is going to be a distraction. You want to do that once you understand what your goal is. And now the problem you're dealing with is, like you said, it's too much data. So I can't do it in an Excel spreadsheet anymore. Or the data is too complex, right? When you have this multidimensional problem I'm talking about, you're not going to figure that out in Excel once you have 10 or 20 variables that you're trying to figure out how they interact and what the cause and effects looks like. But you can definitely do it with one variable when you're starting, and to understand, like, okay, like, how does this generally work? And if I were to understand what my price elasticity looks like, what can I do with that? When you're in that exploratory stage, you don't want to muddy the water with tech yet, or too many people, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, I want to go back to your description, because you've been in this space for a long time, and being a technical mind, some things come very natural to you. So in our conversation, you mentioned them in a very simple way, but it's not obvious to our listeners because they are not tech people. And so I want to go back and, if you like, dissect some of the things and then see if I'm saying things the right way. First of all, you mentioned measuring sales velocity. So I want listeners to understand what sales velocity is, because they usually look at sales. So this is not about dollars. This is about how many orders you're getting per day. And then that number at SKU level, it goes up and down, right? And then you have an average. So by sales velocity, you're referring to knowing that number at SKU level and then measuring that in terms of how it fluctuates. Is that the case?
Yes. So when I said sales velocity, yes, the simplest way to think about it is units per day sold. And knowing that number by itself, by the way, I mean, it's important, but it's not sufficient. What you really want to understand is how that number changes as you change the inputs to it. So the simplest one to understand is pricing, right? I mean, most people understand that most of the time, not always, there are some products where it's not true, but most of the time, if you lower the price, you sell more units. If you raise the price, you sell fewer units. Understanding the relationships between those two things, that's typically what you think of when you say price elasticity, right? How does your sales velocity change with pricing? That's really important because it could impact your inventory strategy. For example, the classic and simplest example is you have a product and your stock is running low and you're at risk of being out of stock. Amazon will penalize you if that happens too often. And so if you understand how your sales velocity, units sold per day, change with pricing, then one of the things you can do, and this is a very basic strategy, I'm sure most of your readers will probably be like, yeah, or listeners know, I know this, but one of your basic strategies would be, okay, I have inventory coming in. I need to make sure that my current stock lasts long enough to get replenished. Let me increase my pricing to reduce my sales per day, so my current stock is going to last long enough until it gets replenished. Now, you don't want to raise your prices more than you have to, because then you're just going to kill your sales, but you don't want to raise it too little because you'll run out of stock. And that's why understanding the relationship between cause and effect is really important for a brand. That's important on day one. And it's important even if you become a $100 million brand. The difference between the day one and the $100 million brand is the complexity of the problem. The problem is not different. It's just the complexity of the problem, because you have more variables to track. You have more things you can change. But at its heart, it's the same idea, understanding the relationship between cause and effect. And once you understand that, you basically tinker with it, you make changes to get the goal that you want. And the goal that most brands want is to optimize their profit margin, maximize it, right? You want the biggest profit margin you can. That's why understanding these two things is important. It's what my co-founder and I are focused on as we build Symphony.
I have something important for all my listeners. Sellers lose money on lost or damaged inventory with Amazon, which can add up to a lot over a year. Did you know that there is a way to claim all your losses? Getida is the global leader in Amazon FBA auditing and reimbursements for Amazon FBA sellers worldwide. They deliver results with no upfront costs. They get paid only when you get paid. Visit www.getida.com/legends to learn more and sign up. And thanks to our friends at Getida, your first $400 in reimbursements will be free. That's www.getida.com/legends and that's www.getida.com/legends. So we've got sales velocity, we've covered price elasticity. That means how you are fluctuating the price based on whatever decisions that you decide to make. But the biggest thing from everything you're telling us that I'm taking away as another thing to keep track of is not actually a data point, but it's a discipline in terms of cause and effect, right? So when you are, so your sales velocity, it goes up and down. Now it goes up and down naturally because consumer behavior, we have no idea what that's going to be. So that's driving what's going on. Given all things remain the same, which they never do, but to a certain extent, they remain the same, assuming consumers behave certain way. And then you want to track what is your sales velocity. But there are things that you do every day. So what you are saying is keep a record of those, in conjunction with the data that you are viewing, so that you can say, oh, my sales velocity went from 3 a day to 5 a day because I did nothing, or because I increased the price or I reduced the price. Or there are even external factors like certain suddenly trends start to take place and things like that, right?
2 words, and remind me if I don't cover these: WBR, weekly business review, and controllable inputs. So for your listeners, Amazon is $1 trillion company. And to this day, they still have weekly business reviews. And you talked about discipline. That's a key thing that brands should put in place. So in the backdrop of everything I said, remember that I keep on emphasizing, you want to understand cause and effect, cause and effect. Most companies, they only look at the output. They look at sales, to your point. But you can't do anything with that information. Your sales was 100 units yesterday. Okay. What you want to understand are what's called the controllable inputs. That's a term that Amazon uses. So the controllable inputs are what parameters, what factors explains the output you saw. You got 100 units sale yesterday. Okay, that's 10 more than last week. Why did it change? Why did it go from 90 to 100? There was some change that happened that drove that increase. When you're a business, what you really want to focus on is those controllable inputs, because those are the things that you can actually have an impact to increase your sales, to decrease your costs, or to maximize your margin. Too many companies, too many brands, they focus only on the outcome, and you can't change the outcome. They will spend hours looking at sales numbers. This many dollars last week, this many units were sold last week. That is a key mistake that brands make, because you can't do anything about that. You want to understand the controllable inputs. And then you want to have the discipline you mentioned. So you want to be able to look at those controllable inputs typically on a weekly basis, because you want to understand, hey, as these inputs are changing, here's what happened. And it's that relationship that's really valuable for you to understand. You're only going to understand it if you look at it periodically in the same way, using the right data.
Yeah. I mean, this is the reason why I love talking to the former Amazon people, because you have these terms that you assign to different things that really say what they are, and at the same time makes it easy to deal with. So controllable input, and those controllable inputs are things that you do something yourself, and then it makes an impact on the outcome. What about external stuff? Like, for example, I live in New York City, and as we record this, it's now June 20th. A couple of weeks ago, we had the wildfires in Canada, and the whole sky turned orange here, and with smoke. So what happened? The mask sales went up. So what do you call that kind of an event?
Actually, it's not going to surprise you. That's an uncontrollable input. Yeah, I mean, one thing that you, by the way, if you ever worked at Amazon, you become really good at, I call it the no BS way of thinking. I think most people have heard that Amazon has got this term called crap, which is can't realize a profit. And so you'll talk about crap products. These are products that you can't make any money on. So yeah, those are called uncontrollable inputs. You still want to understand the cause and effect between them. A classic one, by the way, is weather, right? Weather is an uncontrollable input, but it definitely has an impact on your sales, right? If you sell sweaters, you're not going to make much money in the summer. So that's uncontrollable. The weather is uncontrollable. However, you can make that an input that you can impact that input by switching the channel where you sell, or the channel here, I mean the geography in this case, right? So when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, right, sell your sweaters in the northern when it's winter in the northern hemisphere, sell sweaters in the northern hemisphere. And when the 6 months later, right, when it's summer in the southern hemisphere, shift to those channels and sell down there. And so this is what I mean about, like, you want to understand always the relationship, whether it's controllable or not, because once you understand the relationship, those are the things that you can actually use to make decisions. Just looking at output metrics is not helpful. Right. I've worked at places where you will spend hours looking at just sales numbers and no decision comes from that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I talk to many people and they talk about, oh, I look at my KPIs and blah, blah. I say, okay, can you share with me what your KPIs are? Well, my profits and my sales. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, top line doesn't tell you anything. Your profits don't tell you anything. What is driving that top line? What is driving that profit? Well, I don't know. So that's why I want to get into it. So, okay. Sales velocity, price elasticity, cause and effect, looking at it over time at SKU level. So this automatically spells out, as you put it at the beginning, a multidimensional complexity where you now need to be, and by the way, looking at numbers alone is not good, right? You have to visualize them, right? You can't pick up from numbers trends, but from visualizing you can pick up trends.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, every person's different, but typically you want to visualize the numbers. And so one area where, to go back to your question about spreadsheets or more advanced tools, I always like to tell brands, when you're trying to figure out how you want to visualize data, keep it simple. So you have your data, and again, you're looking at a small set of data because you're figuring out what you want to do. It's perfectly okay to say, I'm going to load that into Excel or Google spreadsheets. I'm going to build some charts that help me figure out how do I want to look at this data. Okay. And once you start to figure out, okay, here's how I want to look at this data. Here's how this data becomes useful for me to make a decision. And again, it's the cause and effect that's valuable. Then that's when you can bring in more sophisticated tools, because now you want to look at this data at scale, right? So you bring in technology at that point. But it's okay to start with as Amazon calls it, a more scrappy solution in the beginning. And you definitely want to visualize your data. So typically the order of operation I tell people or brands is, you want to first figure out how you're going to get the data that you need. The second step is going to be, you want to figure out how you're going to visualize that data. Just look at it. And then the third step is you want to understand the relationship between those data points, cause and effect, how changes to one impacts another. And so there's those three steps in the process. And then you want to make sure you have the discipline to do that on a periodic cadence. And that's actually not as easy as it sounds. I think most people will say, yeah, sure, I can look at my data every week. It's very easy not to prioritize it, and it's very easy to go down the path of focusing on just the output that you can't do anything about.
Yeah. You know how it is. I always say this. So when you have ideas, it's easy to talk about the ideas. And then as soon as, and this could be a creative situation, like you want to make a painting, or you want to write a novel or whatever. You can talk about it in your head. The ideas come to your head and you can talk about it. But say, okay, let's not do it. The minute that you put pen to paper, forget it. It's a non-starter, right? So okay, how is this going to translate into what I want it to do? I mean, I know this is what I want to do, but it's too many moving parts and too many things. And then let's assume that you finally overcome that, and eventually you do, and you start doing it, and you put exactly what you had in your mind as much as possible, as close as possible, on the paper, or doing some kind of a tool, and you look at it, well, that's not really what I had in mind. What it comes out at the end looks totally different, right? So it's not easy. It's never easy. It's easy for us to talk here. So that's why I want to get into the specifics. It's very hard visualizing data. Okay, what kind of visualization? Is it a pie chart? Is it a bar chart? And you don't know, because you can see different things from each one, right?
Well, a couple of things, right? I always say an idea is worth nothing. It's the execution that matters. And that's one of the things that Amazon does really well, by the way. So yes, you have to have an idea, but like you said, you actually have to start executing on them. And that's where you said put paper to pencil. It's important because oftentimes, like you said, the idea that you have is, as you actually start executing it, will change. And that's okay. In fact, you should embrace that as a brand, because ideally, it means that it's changing because you're bringing in factors that you weren't considering when you were only thinking about it, right? And so that's why I say, like, you really want to focus on figuring out what are the decisions you want to make. And you want to start as quickly as you can. So you want to go from the idea phase to the execution phase. You want to do that in a very lightweight method, which is why you don't want to start thinking about the scaling first. You don't want to think about the tech in the beginning. You want to think about, let me do this really quickly. Let me see what it turns out to look like. And then once I know what it's going to look like, now I'm ready to scale really quickly. Yeah. And so we go back to like a simple example of like price elasticity, right? The first thing you want to do as a brand is you want to get your sales data from the e-commerce platforms. And then you want to keep track of what your price was for each SKU over time when you changed it. And you want to, first of all, the first thing I would do is I would plot that. I would have a chart that shows my sales velocity, my sales per day, units per day, with pricing. And you're going to see some sort of curve. That curve that you're seeing is going to tell you what your elasticity is, how a change in price will change your sales velocity. Then you look at your sales velocity and you look at your inventory. You can plot those and you can figure out, okay, given this sales velocity, I'm going to run out of inventory in X amount of time, or I have this amount of inventory in hand, this many days. Now you've started to tie changes to price with how long your inventory will last. And this is simple to do in a spreadsheet, right? Anybody can do this.
Very easy. Well,
but once you start getting more data and you start to scale, that's when you say, okay, now you know what you want to do. Let's take it out of the spreadsheets. Let's bring it into a more sophisticated tool.
Well, here I'm gonna I love this conversation, so I'm gonna kick it up a notch. Okay, so now imagine that chart. You have your sales velocity and the price elasticity, and they are kind of running together. And now bring in the conversion rate into the same chart. So now let's look at what your conversion rate is doing, or what's happening to your conversion rate as the price goes down or goes up, which then ultimately delivers the sales velocity, right? So,
Correct.
so now what you've done is you have studied the impact of your price fluctuations, and at the same time, if the price is going down, what has it done to your profitability? And then if you bring the price up, what does it do to profitability, as well as, you know, your top line, your dollar value, because you may in fact be doing more and more and more business only to generate the same amount of profitability, right?
And that's a good example, because tying it back to something we were talking about earlier, a lot of companies or a lot of brands, they'll spend a lot of time just looking at their conversion rate. They'll have a chart or a table that says conversion rate last week, conversion rate the week before. Just looking at that tells you nothing. You need to understand, like you said, you need to understand your conversion rate changed because of what. Right. And those are the type of charts and views you want to build. Now, I want to be careful. I'm not saying you shouldn't know your conversion rate. You should, of course, but you need to understand what is impacting it. And some of those will be controllable inputs. Some of them will be non-controllable. Again, if you're selling sweaters and it's summer, that's a non-controllable input, but it does impact your conversion rate, of course. But there are controllable ones, which is pricing, because even in the summer, you can sell more sweaters by reducing the price, because some people will say, hey, I'm going to stock up now for the winter, right? So it's understanding that relationship that is always most important. And when you're building dashboards, whether you're doing it in Excel or you're using a more sophisticated tool, you have to understand that you're building these views to understand these relationships so that you can make decisions.
Yeah. One more thing, Elvis, I want to include in this conversation for our listeners to take away. We're talking about looking at certain data points to understand the cause and effect of certain, as you call, controllable inputs, things that you do yourself that impact those data points to change. Make sure that those controllable inputs, you apply them